Good evening. I'm Irene Padilla, Maryland State Librarian, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Viva Latino, Own Voices, Writers, in Conversation. I'd like to thank our co-presenters, Prince George's County Memorial Library System, Frederick County Public Libraries, and Charles County Public Library. The Maryland State Library Agency is responsible for coordinating, facilitating, and supporting the Maryland Libraries Together series. This is a collaboration to engage communities in enriching educational experiences that advance an understanding of the issues of our time. These events are hosted by individual public library systems and made available to all Marylanders through the Maryland Libraries Together series. This program is supported in part by the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the Library Services and Technology Act, administered by the Maryland State Library. Tonight's program will explore the diversity of the Latin community in the United States and the importance of own voices narratives in our cultural awareness. It is now my pleasure to introduce Roberta Phillips, CEO of the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, who will introduce tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Irene. Good evening. My name is Roberta Phillips, and I am the CEO of the Prince George's County Memorial Library System in Maryland. On behalf of PGCMLS, Frederick County Public Libraries, Charles County Public Library, the Prince George's County Human Relations Commission, and all of our partner libraries throughout the state, welcome to tonight's program. We are honored to be a part of the Maryland Libraries Together series, which was inspired by the phenomenal statewide participation in our Ibram X. Kendi event last summer. Tonight's program is supported in part by the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the Library Services and Technology Act, administered by the Maryland State Library. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome and thank our three ASL interpreters, Patty, Monica, and Nuno Miguel. Tonight's program, Viva Latino, Own Voices, Writers in Conversation, explores some of the many ways Hispanic culture and identity is discussed in literature and poetry. Our guests tonight are some of the most important literary figures in their generations. They represent just a fraction of the spectrum of diversity within Hispanic culture. We were fortunate to host Puerto Rican author and journalist Ed Morales last week and look forward to continuing to showcase the many aspects of Hispanic culture in future programs. And now I'd like to introduce our special guest. Julio Alvarez left the Dominican Republic for the United States in 1960 at the age of 10. She is the author of 6 novels, including Afterlife, which comes out in paperback on April 6th. In the Time of Butterflies, with over 1 million copies in print, was selected by the National Endowment of the Arts for its National Big Read program. And in 2013, President Obama awarded Alvarez the National Medal of Arts in recognition of her extraordinary storytelling. Angie Cruz is a New York-born Dominicana who traveled to and from New York City to DR for most of her formative years. Her first novel, Soledad, and second novel, Let It Rain Coffee, were first published by Simon & Schuster. Her novel, Dominicana, published fall 2019 with Flatiron Books, was inspired by her mother's arrival story. To research this novel, Angie scoured many photo albums, and this inspired the digital photo archive accessed through Instagram at Dominicanas NYC. Reyna Grande is an award-winning novelist and memoirist. Her latest book, A Dream Called Home, was released on October 2nd, 2018. Her critically acclaimed memoir, The Distance Between Us, was a National Book Critics Circles Award finalist. In that book, Reyna writes about her life before and after coming to the U.S. as an undocumented child immigrant. It is about what is lost and what is gained in the pursuit of a better life. Born in Mexico in 1975, Grande was raised by her grandparents after her parents left her behind while they worked in the U.S. She came to the U.S. at the age of 9 as an undocumented immigrant and went on to become the first person in her family to obtain a higher education. Juan Felipe Herrera is the 21st Poet Laureate of the United States, 2015 to 2016, and is the first Latino to hold this position. From 2012 to 2014, Herrera served as California State Poet Laureate. Herrera's many collections of poetry include Every Day We Get More Illegal, Notes on the Assemblage, Senegal Taxi, Half the World in Light, New and Selected Poems. A recipient of the Pen Beyond Margins Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award, and 187 Reasons Mexicanos Can't Cross the Border on documents 1971 through 2007. His book, Jabberwalking, a children's book focused on turning your wonder at the world around you into weird, wild, incandescent poetry, came out in 2018. Herrera is also a performance artist and activist on behalf of migrant, indigenous communities, and at-risk youth. Our moderator this evening is Lupita Aquino, and she is a clinical research professional by day and bookstagrammer by night. She is the co-founder and current moderator for LIT on H Street Book Club at Social State Books. She is a passionate reader, amplifying and highlighting books within by authors of color through her Instagram and blog. When she's not reading, you can find her spending her days with her wife and son at a local independent bookstore. She currently lives in Maryland, and you can find her on Instagram at lupita.reads, on Twitter at lupita.reads, or catch her column over at Washington Independent Review of Books. Lastly, I encourage you to borrow these wonderful authors' books from your local public library. You are welcome to obtain a free PGCMLS virtual library card, even if you live outside the area, by visiting pgcmls.info. Books are available for purchase through our partner, Loyalty Books, at the link you'll see in the chat. With that, I'll turn it over to Lupita and our fabulous guests. Enjoy.
Hi, everybody. I just want to say a quick thank you to PGCMLS for bringing us together as a reader, this panel of authors that I have long admired for a very, very, very long time. It's a dream come true to be able to talk to you all. So I'm really thankful to PGCMLS for making this happen and for Maryland Libraries. As a Marylander, that grew up in the library system. It's something that is like a full circle moment for me, because that's how I access books, through libraries first. And that's how it did it for me. So I know we're here talking about own voices, and right before we kick off into the meat of the discussion, I want to start off with a question that I think I'm really curious about to know from the rest of the panel here, and it's I was curious if you could share the first time you experienced feeling yourself represented or seen in a book. How old were you, and how it and if it contributed to you becoming a writer? And we can start with Julia.
Always with the A. Last week. Thank you, Lupita, and to my panelists. It's wonderful to be here. I wish I could just sit and listen, because I'm so curious. So many good questions you sent us to think about, and I don't have any answers. But the first book that I remember, I don't know how far back you want to go, was
as far back as you want to go.
Okay, I wasn't a reader. I was growing up in the DR. I was a girl in the 50s. We weren't supposed to get that much of an education. And I hated school. I hated reading. It was an oral culture. It was a dictatorship. So books sort of typecast you as an intellectual and troublemaker. People didn't really read, but they had Radio Bemba, it was called. Radio Big Mouth. That's the oral culture. So I loved storytelling. And the only book I remember from that time was given to me by my only auntie who read, Titi. And she was a Hamona. She was 23, and she wasn't married because no man was going to marry a woman that had her nose in a book. So that also gave reading a bad reputation. Anyhow, she gave me a book. We had these readers, and in English class we had this Dick and Jane, and I didn't get it. And she gave me 1001 Arabian Nights, and there was a brown girl on the cover who could have been Dominican, and she was telling stories to this cruel sultan. I didn't make the connection with Trujillo and our dictator, but something about how she told stories and freed and saved all the women in the kingdom as well as herself, and changed the sultan's heart by telling stories. That was the first time I thought, oh my goodness, first I could be that girl. She looks like my people. And second,
Yeah.
I want that power. So that was the first one. Other books came with the United States and going to school and getting, a college degree, but that was the first one.
No, it's beautiful. That I love that you said you want that power, right? That there's that power in storytelling that I think is something that is such a privilege to have. It's beautiful. Yeah.
But it's also the power to save other people in your community through the telling of a story and changing the powers that be. I mean, it spreads, not just personal power.
Right, exactly. No, definitely. Angie, how about you?
Well,
Following with the A's.
yeah, we're out of. First of all, thank you so much for the Maryland libraries, and thank you. This is such a privilege to be in this company. My first book that I purchased, I remember vividly, was Julia Alvarez in The Girls Lost Their Accent. I was walking on 83rd Street, Barnes and Nobles, by Barnes and Nobles on 83rd Street in New York City, and I remember looking at the window. It was like early 90s, and I saw a book and it said Alvarez, Garcia, accent, and I said, what is this? And I went inside and I saw she was Dominican and I bought it, and it was like mind-blowing. Up until that moment, I had only read books by dead white men, so it was like, oh my God, like this is something close to something I knew. So I have a deep affection for your work, Julia, who really a pioneer for me. So, I'm glad to share the story and with you.
And you're a writer, so like that full circle moment there too is something that I'm sure, Julia, you're like, it's got to be really impactful.
Well, also saying about when you talk about 1001 Nights, like that idea of the power of storytelling and how you write a story, and I don't know, Julia, what you thought, where that book would land, right? But did you imagine that it would land on my lap and that would open the path for me to become a writer? Is kind of amazing, because I needed your stories when I was in my early 20s. Like it was very affirming for me, and it did save me. So thank you.
That's gorgeous. Reyna.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna say culturally, the first book I read that I saw myself in was The Moths and Other Stories by Elena Maria Viramontes. That was actually the first book I ever owned. My English professor at the community college gave it to me for my 19th birthday. And I saw myself in it because, it was a story about Mexican Americans in East LA, and I was living in LA and in Highland Park. But another book that I connected to earlier, before that, when I was in my teens, when I was like 13, was I was reading a lot of V.C. Andrews, and I read a lot of books by white people about white kids, but that book, Flowers in the Attic, it was one of the first white books I connected to because, there was an evil grandmother in that book, and there was a very irresponsible mother in that book, and the siblings were really literally trapped in an attic, depending on the evil grandmother and the irresponsible mother. And that was one of the first times I connected to a story about white kids, because I had an evil grandmother and I had an irresponsible mother. And then I was really shocked that like white kids could actually suffer in the same way I had suffered too because of my evil grandmother and my bad mother. So yeah, to me, like that was one of those moments where I always felt, well, I can't really relate to white characters, but that was one moment when I actually did relate.
I love that you said that too, because like for me, there are the two separate moments, right? There's culturally, and you know, there was just feeling like understood, which for me it was the Yaya sisterhood that I read, and I was like, okay, I feel understood. But the characters shared nothing in terms of like community or anything related. It was just like who they were, what they were going through, that I was able to connect through. And so that you answered my question in the trick way that I was trying to ask it. How about you, Juan?
That's a really cool question. I was just a rambler, a migrant child. My mother would recite poems to me, and once she remembered from El Paso, and maybe it was third grade, or maybe it was way back in the orphanages of during the Mexican Revolution, because she was put in an orphanage, so she learned some little songs there or rhymes, and in El Paso, some songs and rhymes, and corridos, Mexican ballads of revolution. So that's and lullabies and just stories. My mother always telling stories of our family through the photographs. My grandmother had all the photos from the children, and my three uncles went to Fort Bliss to join the army because I was part of the trek from blasted Mexico City, blasted because of the revolution. Things were just up and down and upside down. So that trek to Juarez and then to El Paso, I had all those elements in it. I had the element of that journey and revolution, stories, and Juarez life, and then joining the army. And all that had a lot of material in it, and stories and photographs, which my mother inherited from my grandmother. So that was like my book, my mother's album was my book. And in terms of books, officialized books, I guess that was during high school. I got into Antonin Artaud, the surrealist poet of the 20s and 30s, and all his friends, and Lorca and all his friends.
Yeah.
And that was the world, as you know, in the 60s. It was underground films, it was surrealism, it was Hindu yoga and India and Eastern thought. And for me, it was beauty, it was beauty for me. And so that's where I got going in terms of culture and language and intensity and what artists and writers do and how they do it. Very inspiring for me. And then one day on B Street in San Diego, which is like downtown. I lived downtown for a while after coming up from Logan Heights, Barrio, in San Diego. I went to visit Lurista, who was a friend of mine since 7th grade, who became a really well-known and pioneering Chicano poet. And he told me one day, he goes, you know what, Juan? I go, what? Well, from this day on, yeah, I'm a Chicano. A what? A what? A Chicano? Okay, you're a Chicano. Good for you. So what happened maybe a year later was I got into UCLA through affirmative action, and which was really nice. And even though I bombed out on the essay and I had to take whatever that English class was where you have to, just doodle around, So I became part of the Chicano literary movement and the civil rights movement. And that's where I felt what it was to write and speak and to connect with your communities, with our communities. And that was the fuel for the rest of my life, is to tell the stories and to bring in the words and to continue doing those discoveries and commitments. And that's how I started.
Wow.
And that's what moved me. Of course, I was a library. I think I lived in the library.
Yeah.
And I was just so fascinated by the books in the library. And we could talk more, but that's really what happened. I really love the library.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask too, just randomly, if everybody else has connections to the libraries in the same way. And, you know, for me personally, it was my mom who was the one that encouraged the libraries and that connected me to the libraries outside of school. So, and I'm curious for everybody else, was there a person in your life that you had that encouraged that connection, maybe fueled it? And
no, I mean, I think I'm definitely a product of the public library, but I just happened to discover it because it was near my junior high. But nobody took me to the library, and definitely my parents did not encourage my reading because they were not readers. We didn't have any books at home. And also, you know, my family was very poor in Mexico, and books are very expensive in Mexico. Even to this day, like when the Distance Between Us was published in Mexico, and I went to do a reading, and my book costs 200 pesos. And most people there, like poor people, make 100 pesos a day. So it costs them 2 days worth of wages to buy my book. Nobody's going to be buying a book if it costs 2 days worth of wages, you know? And that was the reality in my family when I was growing up in Mexico, is like, we couldn't be readers, you know, reading was a luxury. Books were a luxury. And it wasn't until I immigrated and I was in Los Angeles that I had access to books because of the public library. And I know that if it hadn't been for that, I don't think I would be a writer now, because you have to be a reader to be a writer.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Anyone else want to add to that?
You go ahead.
Sorry.
Julia. So yours, Julia.
Well, no, my teacher did. It was the first time, 6th grade, came into the United States, 6th grade, and it was not a very pleasant place, you know, bullies and name calling and our accents, the whole works. But I had a teacher who could tell that I loved stories. When she would tell a story, I would be listening. And she somehow convinced me, I wasn't a reader, that within the covers of books weren't just stupid stories that had nothing to do with anything that I was interested in. And they weren't propaganda from the dictatorship. That within the covers of books, there were all the stories that I loved, like, you know, stories that Tias would tell, like the interesting stories, good stories. And so it was in the library, because my parents couldn't recommend a book. They weren't really readers. So that was discovering the library. And then, you know, librarians that took an interest, and they saw what I liked, and they encouraged me, and they had a book. And I couldn't believe, because we didn't have a public library system in the DR. I kept saying, pero mami, how do they know that the people are going to return the books? You can take them home, you know, because it wasn't a dictatorship, so you wouldn't be killed if you didn't return them. You know, so I just was amazed that this could happen. So yeah, that was a teacher that me there.
You know, I actually, thinking about the library in my neighborhood when I was a kid, it was like I grew up in a moment in New York City where it was very dangerous to walk the streets as a young woman in particular, for everyone maybe, but I do appreciate library spaces in schools, which are actually something that most schools don't have now in New York City in particular. When I was doing book tours and things like live school tours. And it's because it's not a real, like they're turning those spaces into computer rooms. And I remember for me, the library was the quiet space where everything was possible. And I'm so grateful for those spaces in schools. And I'm grateful for the people who, because my mother wasn't a reader, and she didn't even understand that you could borrow books for free. Like, she didn't have the cultural capital to understand that libraries were something accessible in our community. I'm so grateful for the people that, like teachers, that went out of their way to literally walk me to that building and say, this is something for you. I couldn't convince my mother that it's okay for me to walk there. But when I was of age and I was able to do it on my own, I'm really grateful for the people that go out of their way. I think we take for granted sometimes that even if these resources exist, especially for undocumented or children who are being raised by parents who didn't have libraries at home, they might not even realize that's a resource. And I think it's really great when teachers and these facilitators to these spaces are doing that work. I mean, we all have the power to do that work. That's what I'm saying. So I'm saying it here because I feel like we have an audience of people who love libraries, and also to think about how we can also make sure that people know that they're there with full of resources for those that don't have access because they don't have that capital.
Yeah.
Juan, do you want to add anything?
Oh yes, I just absolutely love the libraries. I live in the barrio in Logan Heights, and then I live downtown San Diego. And when I hit downtown, there's a library a couple of blocks from where we live. We live like in a 3-story hotel-like looking place, on one of the little tiny rooms in that big old building. And right down 2 blocks away on 10th, I think, 9th and East Street in San Diego, there was a library, the public library. And I went in there and they had these big, beautiful tables. I go, wow, look at these tables. Hey, geez, it's really nice in here. It's like a real house, you know? And so I felt really good in there. And then I walked around, I just floated around. And I saw the titles on the back, on the spines of the books. And they would be really interesting titles. And I kind of fell in love with titles and the color of the books. And then I found Toulouse-Lautrec's a story, I guess a biography of Toulouse-Lautrec, which I had known about in my high school art class. And so I just loved that book and the color of that book. And then they had, as you know, back then they had music studios, glass rooms in the library. You'd go in the glass room with I took a stack, of albums, and Joan Baez, blues singers, John Hammond, and Feliciano, and all kinds of groovy stuff. Kind of listen to it and sit back and listen, and folk songs. That was folk song era, and Woody Guthrie, and that was one of my favorite places too. And then Scientific American magazine, all the isotopes and things like that. And then it was just a beautiful place to just discover and just throw your body and mind into and heart into these new worlds. So I just loved the library. And I write a lot in libraries. In the past, I've written a lot because it's such a groovy place to write. Since everybody's a writer in the library, you might as well jump in and write.
Yeah. No, and I love that you mentioned that the libraries aren't just there for books. There's definitely different types of mediums that you can access through the libraries. So that's something really important. But I do want to shift us to our Own Voices chat, which is why we're here. And I don't want to take any more from that. But I want to open with talking about this quote from Sadia Faruqa, author Sadia Faruqa, who said, Own Voices was created to give people of color the same opportunity that others have. It's a reminder that not only is a story important, but also who tells that story. It means understanding when to sit down and let someone else talk. So I'd love to hear any initial thoughts or reactions to this definition of Own Voices. But mainly, what does Own Voices mean to you? And what is the value in a story being told by someone that has lived that experience? And I'll start with Angie.
Oh no!
I caught you off guard.
I mean, I think it's an interesting moment. I feel like if it wasn't for the movement that got started with Own Voices, like it's possible that my book would have not found an editor or a home, which is unfortunate because I like to share the story if there are writers in the room that Dominicana had circulated for many, many years and nobody was willing to take a chance on it. And then there was this movement. There literally was this grassroots movement that started by many women, actually. And I think many of them who who wanted to diversity in books, but also to make sure that the books that are getting into, that are being written about people of color were written by people of color. Not that I think we really as writers should feel free to write about whatever we want, honestly, but the underrepresentation of writers of color in publishing is so awful that I'm really glad that there is a movement of own voices. And for me, I feel kind of like I've been a beneficiary in the way that it's possible that publishing might have not taken the chance on my book if there wasn't a big movement toward own voices and how important it is to publish a story about a Dominicana by a Dominicana. So I'm really excited about this, but I do think, like, as important as I think it is, I do think that in the end, as a writer, the reason I became a writer is not to write about the things I know. It's about to write about the things I don't know, or the things I want to write into what I don't understand. I don't know what it's like to be an 80-year-old man, but my last book, Let It Rain Coffee, is about an 80-year-old man. I don't know what it's like to be a 15-year-old, child bride living in 1965, and yet I wrote that story, right? And part of our work as writers is also to be researchers and to think outside of our experience. So as much as I embrace this movement, because I think it's forced a kind of attention to a huge problem, I also think that as a writer, I feel like as writers, as creative people, as artists, we have to also follow the thing that we know we have to tell. So when I hear Juan Felipe was talking about some of his earlier readings connected to Buddhism and all these different things, like, I feel like, for me, like a book like Siddhartha when I was in high school was really influential. And I think why, right? Like, what was it that I was trying to reach there that's very different than the things I know, right? Like, I like to read because it's about things I don't always know. So,
yeah. Julia, do you want to add anything? Or
Well, this is, Angie, thank you for that, because it's such a complicated question and you touched on the whole spectrum of it. First off, my first novel, How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, wasn't published till I was 41, and I'd already been writing for over 20 years. And whenever I sent a story out or something from it, I was told that, did I look into the sociological journals? Because if you wrote about Latino characters, it was sociology, it wasn't literature. So, it just would, I have a historical perspective, now being a viejita, sorry to pull the age card, but I see it as a progression, that it didn't just happen. It's widening and spreading into the corporate world. But, when Sandra Cisneros and Denise Chavez and Elena Maria Miramontes, some of the people that have been mentioned, got started, really, it was small regional magazines that would publish us.
Wow.
And so I think it's important to know that, that old viejita story, the viejita, she's a young girl, tries to reach the stars, and finally as an old woman touches the stars, Father Sky looks down and says, "How do you get to be so tall?" And she says, "I'm standing on a lot of shoulders." So we're all standing on a lot of shoulders. If Maxine Hong Kingston hadn't come out with Woman Warrior, it was about Chinese American, but it was a big thing. And suddenly ethnic writers, we got to find an ethnic writer. And then we had the luck of someone like Susan Burkholz, our agent for Sandra, for myself, for Ana Castillo, for Loida Maritza Perez, all of us. And she was, she stopped telling me after the 13th try to publish Garcia Girls that there was another rejection, because she knew I would just get downcast. And, so there is a lucha that has been going on. It's now really public and spreading, and that's great. But it did begin earlier, and we have to acknowledge those that came before us. And I'm not just talking about me, the generations even before myself. And in terms of telling, thank you, Angie, that, part of the thing that we write not because we know things, we write because we want to find things out. And to me, what I always loved about the story is that the erasure of myself, that I became the other. You know, I became a prince, a pauper, a black girl in the South. I became a little white racist boy on a raft with a black man. You know, and this, you know, this ability to enter others is a muscle that I think is the muscle also of social justice and compassion. So I think that both things, thanks Angie for setting the whole thing, both things are important, both to represent and speak from your community, but also to engage, not just the others engaging in us who have been the othered, but for us to also do that as well. I mean, we've had to because we've read mostly white writers. Our muscles are really well developed. We always had somebody that wasn't like us, you know. But yeah.
Oh, that's extremely true. Juan?
About writing. You know, it's been kind of it's kind of my life, and it just turned into my life. And all these moments, like right now, they're very beautiful moments, and each one contributes to my connection to humanity and my insights that I gain at this very moment that I'm gaining, and it widens the picture. You know, it like Angie and Julia have spoken. You know, our life, our words, who we are, expands until we kind of disappear. You know, we weren't really that. It really wasn't just about us. It was about the entire humanity, and then beyond. So that's my sense. You know, identity is very interesting, but it's also very malleable, and it changes, and it's a prism. And then we break through it, and there's another prism to break through, and there's many insights. And Julia mentioned compassion, and I think that's what we're doing also, writing and books and libraries and expression and speaking, and letting ourselves really break through ourselves into that figure called an audience or the community. Really is all about compassion. You know, it's breaking away from chains. It's breaking into places that have walls. It's unleashing those. It's melting away those walls and those barriers at whatever level, and then letting ourselves just harmonize and be harmonized by everything and everyone. And all that is compassion. You know, all that is being one. So that's what it's come down. It started with a very defined. I started a very defined project, maybe in 1969, and at UCLA, and then now it's not that defined. It's totally open.
Well, thank you, Reyna. Do you have anything to add?
Hi. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate what everybody has said so far, and I want to echo what Angie said about when it comes to, you know, the problem is not that we don't want people writing about what they don't know or writing outside of their culture, outside of their experience. A lot of times, for me, it's more about the publishing business and the double standard with which it treats writers of color, right? And that's something that I feel that the Own Voices movement has tried to address, is the problems within the publishing business. And I guess it just makes me sad, like what Julia was saying, that, you know, her generation were working really, really hard to break some of those barriers. But even before her generation was another generation before that who was fighting. And then it just makes me think, like, man, how long is this fight gonna last? Is that every single generation has to, like, pick up the machetes and keep, like, hacking away? Like, how long, how much more are we expected to keep fighting to break this barrier down? And I feel that, we make progress, and then sometimes the wall gets built up again, and then we have to keep knocking it down, and then it gets built up again. And it just, I guess it gets really tiring. And I really wish that that a point will come when we don't have to do that anymore. But the reality is that there's going to have to be more protests and more own voices movements, and like every generation is seeing the same challenges over and over again. So, but that's a very defeatist point of view, and I know that. So to cheer myself up, I just tell myself, you know what, I can only do what I can do. And what I can do, what I have control over, is me like trying to like offer the best writing I can offer to the world, to mentor young readers, young writers, and try to open doors for them, or keep the door open for them, and just doing that, and that's something that has really brought me a lot of joy, is being able to mentor our next generation of writers and prepare them for the fight, but being there for them, giving them the tools and the weapons they need to make sure that they succeed, and they keep breaking down the barriers for the next generation.
Can I just pop in? I know we have questions, but I wanted to say that, I actually have been reading a lot from writers of the 60s and 70s, and thinking about like the conversations we're having now are not new. And it's true what Julia's saying. It's like the fight is ongoing and continuous. And I'm lucky for me, I've had beautiful conversations with Elena Maria Viramontes and Sandra Cisneros, and and all these writers who try to create alternative spaces, which I call adjacent to the institution, to help. And I think Macondo is one of them. I think like there's just so many wonderful spaces that have been created by women of color to support each other. And I feel like one of the reasons things don't change, like you say, what I've been thinking about why things don't change is because the system has been really successful, unfortunately, to keep us away from each other in conversation. And this is why I feel like what's different about this moment right now is that we don't only have an Own Voices movement. We have a Black Lives Matter movement. We have an anti-racism movement. We have Me Too, which is bringing up like issues around sexism and patriarchy that maybe we were not talking about in the past. And one of the reasons that a lot of women of color, as I understand it, were marginalized were because the men left them out of the conversation over and over and over again. So this moment, I think, does have something that's unique about that allows a possibility for coalition building among us. I feel like I'm having really interesting conversations with people across generations and also across culture, that maybe there could be a shift. And I don't know how, right? Because I feel like capitalism and power and greed is still a real thing. But I think the shift of us bringing in the thing that we do well, I think, as Latinx community, where we know how to be interdependent. And I've learned a lot from watching Julia and her coalition building with Haitian communities and writers, and the work that she's doing on the border, and many, many writers are doing. I think that something could happen. So I know the defeatism. I mean, when you listen to these people, they're like, we're still fighting. But I do think the change is going to happen if we continue the conversation about how do we start working together to make sure that these books are published, and also that they get to our communities who don't always know how to get to our books.
Yeah. And I think that's ultimately like a huge problem too, not only the Own Voices writers and authors movement, but the Own Voices readers movement, which is how do you get these books written by Own Voices writers into the hands of readers?
And Lupita, you do that work. This is your work.
Yay.
I love listening to you all, and I love. I think something I keep hearing too that comes up is, wanting to write into things that you don't know. And I'm curious in terms of like external pressures that you feel while writing stories, like, and how you allow yourself to write into what you don't know versus in the comfort of what you know, what you've experienced. Is that pressure something that lives on you like a monkey or somewhere, while you're trying to write? And I'll start with Julia.
Well, I read that and I thought, gosh, if I did that, I couldn't write. If I let that be, I have to block that out. The pressures, and in that here I was complaining before we all came on about the snow in Vermont. One of the good things about Vermont is that there's no publication, but there's no, now there's nothing because of the quarantine anywhere. But, the pressures aren't here. And, there's a sheep farmer next door. And my biggest compliment was when he said, after about 15 years, he said, "I seen your books in the library." And I thought, wow. So it just says there's a kind of a democracy and a non-privileging. And I don't know, if I know what I'm supposed to write about, it's like homework. I don't want to do it. I mean, it's boring because I'm writing to find things out. I'm writing to enter the mystery, to be a swarm in that mystery. And the market doesn't want that. It's too unpredictable. And it makes me think, too, that, the writers that I really admire, every book that they write I don't necessarily like, but their sensibility and their sense of curiosity and their exploration and their courage in just striking out keeps me wanting to follow that writer, that career. So I think that's, if there was pressure there, I probably ignored it. Because I didn't want to write the same book I wrote before, because each book I have to learn how to write it. And that's part of the awfulness. It's, you want to take it easy in the next book, but it's part of the challenge and what keeps me going. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's probably out there, the pressure, but I just can't
cancel it out.
Well, otherwise I would, and they enter my head. I always said, somebody said to me once, "What is your writing process?" I said, "My writing process is to stay one sentence ahead of the Furies." The Furies are all those voices of judgment telling me what to do, telling me you can't do it, telling you that, and I just have to stay one sentence ahead of it. And I don't always. That's writer's block to me when I let them catch up with me.
That's great. Reyna, how about you?
Yeah, well, I have to say that my first 4 books were written about things that I know. And I wrote about myself. Even my fiction, my 2 novels were somewhat autobiographical. And of course, the memoirs were autobiographical. But then when I started writing this new book, this novel, I wanted to challenge myself and write about something I didn't know. So I ended up writing a novel that is set during the 1840s. So it's a time period I didn't live through. And my main character was an Irish soldier. So it's like, I'm not Irish and I'm not a man. What do I know about being an Irish male? But it was a challenge for me. Like, I just wanted to step out of my own experience so that I could learn something new. And that's what I embarked on this novel. And it's been a really wonderful experience to be able to write about a life I did not live through, a time period I didn't live through. And I have learned a lot in the process. So I definitely feel that I have grown as a writer because this book was very challenging. And I was scared. I kept asking myself, like, what right do I have, to write about the Irish culture? when the book is published, are the Irish readers going to complain that, you know, a Mexican wrote about one of their own? I don't know, but for me, I feel that I wrote about that culture in a very respectful way, and it's the book in it's sort of like a love letter to them too, because I'm writing about the Irish soldiers who deserted the U.S. Army and switched sides to fight for Mexico. So in a way, it's a love letter. It's a thank you, you know, for what they did.
Wow.
How about you, Juan? Have you experienced any pressures in trying to write outside of what you know or what you would say have a lived experience in?
Well, you know, the feeling of maybe having to or wanting to or to keep wanting to write with your cohort, with your team, with your cultural posse. That's we learn a lot. You know, we learn a lot that way. You know, Francisco Alarcón got into kind of pre-Columbian Aztec examinations in his Serpent Poems book, and which is one of the great books in poetry and written by a Chicano. And so you know, that influences us, doesn't it? You know, what we write and with each other, and then for each other and for our community. But those capsules are permeable and they dissolve. So we begin to find out that Dominicano, Mexicano, Latino, Filipino, and on, Hawaiian, and on, and indigenous, we kind of, there are many points where we just kind of crisscross and become one. And that's, I like that, you know, I'm for that. And I orient myself towards that. So the pressure maybe was there in 1970, 1971 through 1974, since that was really, you know, it was really hot, and it was a great feeling to be in that group, you know. Aztec dance, Nahuatl, bilingual poetry, you know, letting my hair go down to my toes and back, and spinning on top of the pyramid and the Tajín in Veracruz, and singing in Teotihuacan. And I mean, that was just fabulous, with hundreds and hundreds of Latinos from Chile all the way to New York, Puerto Ricanos. So that was an incredible embrace, you know, a continental embrace, and which was one of our themes. You know, it was Amerindia, you know, being the continent, being Latin America, being the Caribbean, and embracing all of us in one, and through our writing and through our work. So I have loved that. And the pressure, it was just an organic, you know, this is what I am, you know, we're just connected, like a weaving, a sarape, or, you know, just being one. And of course that changed. There was more definition, there was more professionalization, there was more careership, and all of a sudden we had to duke it out on our own, right? Each one of us had to find ourselves or find a group, a small group or whatever, to continue and to deal with the, you know, literary institutions of the day and on. So, but we know what really stands out now for me, and as I know this is all something that you know as well, is it's almost no longer a culture. You know, the question really is no longer culture, and of course it's power. And within that question of power, we have this psychological, or for the moment, psychological existence of rage and hate. That has become the tornado. It has become the I don't know what to call it, the gear, the tornado, the age that we're in, the moment, the era, the epoch that we've entered into. And that's what we're in. That's what I'm in. That's what we're all in. So how do we address that and change it, or affect it, or notice it, or talk about it as writers?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think all of you are doing it in some way through your work. Angie, I don't want to leave you out. I would love to hear any thoughts you have on pressures, external ones, how you deal with them, how you don't. I still love what Julia said about being one step ahead of them, which makes so much sense.
Like at this point, I feel really fortunate that I don't care.
Oh.
I want to be, I feel like, so many people fought for the freedom I have, all the sacrifices my family has made for me to have the freedom to be able to sit alone with paper and to tell any story I want. I just want to have fun, and I want to follow my curiosity. Like Julia says, like, I'm interested in writers that take risks, and I want to take risks, and I think if you feel, when you say pressure, I think market pressure?
Could be market pressure, external pressure,
community pressure,
community pressure.
I feel all of that is a distraction, distraction from doing the important work. Like, Toni Morrison said in the 70s, like, racism is a distraction. Like, I don't feel any need to prove my value. I feel really lucky that I'm surrounded by people that remind me every day through the way they look at me. And through the way they receive me, that I have value and my work is valuable, through the readers that are reading and write to me, that I just want to do whatever I want right now. And I feel really lucky. And I hope every writer could find that place, because al final, we're alone in this thing. Like, when you're writing, like, it's just you and the page, and you might as well enjoy it, because it's not an easy task. It's actually very difficult to be with yourself and with your own ideas, and then putting it out there. So,
no, I mean, that's powerful. So I do want to let the audience know that, we're going to open up some time for everyone else to ask questions. I have a whole list of questions that we haven't gone through, but I know that we are going to be cutting close on time. So feel free to go ahead, start putting in your questions, and then we'll have Nick and them who are organizing. They'll send them to me, and I will be asking our panelists here. So I guess one more question before we jump into audience questions. I'd love us to talk about. I saw a statistic, and I wish I could say where it was from, but I was in a rush, but I saw a statistic with a number of Latinx author books that get published, and it was significantly less than the ones that actually include just Latinx characters or have Latinx themes in them. It was like 30% of it was actually Latinx authored books. So, I'm just curious just thinking about it, what kept coming to me was what prevents Latinx authors from being published and from, writing their own stories and telling their own stories. And again, this is, I feel like, in the vein of own voices. What is preventing it? What obstacles did you guys have to overcome to get published? And I know that's a very big question, so feel free to take your time. Who doesn't want to go first? Let's go then. I was just kidding. Angie, I'm going to have you go first.
Yeah, I mean, I've been telling my story because I think it's like a Cinderella one, I guess. Like, so I spent 10 years working on the book. It had different reiterations, and it went out to many, many different kinds of editors, small presses and big presses, and the response was always the same. And it was, it's too dark, it's too bleak. And the editors who were interested in it would say, change the ending. Like, could you end it more uplifting story? Or could you add more? I would just told explicitly, can you add more food, more music, more, whatever they thought would bring more joy to the story. I mean, the story is about domestic violence. It's about a child bride. It's about a 15-year-old married to a man twice your age. Like, I felt kind of like, that's not the book I want to write, like one of, joyous ending. And editors were very frustrated. And they said, it's just, I read the book and I want to throw it across the room. And I said, you know what? I want this problem to end. So I like that you have that feeling. So that way, maybe if you finish the book, you don't feel comfortable. And you think, maybe something should be done about the countless of young women that are exposed to this experience, which are so many. And I just, I didn't give up. I had a great agent, and she said, you know what, this is the book you want to write. This is the book we're going to sell. And I finally found an editor. And I want to tell this story. It's kind of crazy because the editor had the book on her desk for 2 years.
Wow.
She had never rejected it. And 2 years later, when she was high up enough in her publishing house, where she had more influence, because not all editors. One thing people don't understand is that an editor can love a book. It doesn't mean that she can buy the book. Many editors love books they can't actually acquire, right? They need to get sales and marketing and everybody championing the book. And until she had the ability to get everyone in the house to champion the book, she didn't pitch it. And that's when I sold the book. So I think that, yes, in some ways, the book, for some, they didn't think it had a market, because I think Latinx books, people are like, what is the market? Where is it going to go? But I also think that, again, like I said, if it wasn't for the big push for own voices and Trump, maybe what Trump was doing that made us all a little crazy and also accelerated an opening, right? I think it would have been harder for an editor to say, we need this. There are no representation for this voice, right? So I'm grateful for all these different, we need diverse books, Black lives, all these different things that were happening. Plus, I wrote a book, right? You need to write a book in order to sell a book.
Yeah.
People forget that, right? And I was persistent and I didn't give up. So I think all of those things. But I do think there is a bias against stories that have not proven, that don't have precedent. And with Latino stories, we have not a lot of precedent.
Right.
So it's hard to sell them,
I think a problem too can also be the lack of access to knowledge. Like I know, like I went for my undergrad, I studied creative writing. I majored in creative writing, and all we ever talked about was the craft. So I learned all about the craft. Not once did we talk about the publishing side of writing.
Wow.
So when I graduated from university, I knew how to write, but I didn't know how to sell my writing. I had absolutely no idea how to go about reaching out to anybody in the industry. And I actually thought that I could go buy the newspapers and look in the classified section to see if agents had an ad in there that they were looking for writers, or that editors posted ads that they were looking for a novelist to write a novel. I mean, that's how ignorant I was. So then I realized after I saw that they do not put ads in the paper, that I had no idea how to make my dream of being a writer come true. And it took me 3 years until I finally was very, very lucky to get accepted into the Emerging Voices Fellowship program offered by PEN America. That's when I learned about the publishing industry. That's when I learned about agents and how to pitch to agents and editors and all of that. And once I learned that, that's when things started to happen for me. So even before you get to the point of pitching your editors, first you need to have the knowledge, right? And I think that that's where we need to work harder on making sure that our young writers have that knowledge, that they have the support that they need.
And it's important that, from all that you mentioned, it's important to remember that we need advocates. Not everybody is going to be great at selling their books or pushing forward, different personalities. And there are helpers along the way, and to find them, and to, again, a book, we're the face of the book, we're the author, but there's so many invisible hands. I mean, I'm reminded that, Angie, you mentioned it, just, members of your familia that made sacrifices. So you could, those are part of the book, people that sell it and so forth in a company, your editor, your agent, all these people are part of of your helpers. And without them, I know I wouldn't, my one attempt to do it for myself was when I was about 17, I had a book of poems, handwritten. and my tia that read had a friend who worked at Harper and Row. And with my little hat, she called her and said, could Julia come and talk to you about being a writer? And I brought my little handwritten book. And I asked her if she would publish it. I had a lot to learn. But that was my one attempt to do it myself, not even typed. So we do need helpers. And, it's a good reminder. I don't know who made the point that, publishing houses are now owned, the big ones, by people that own fossil fuel companies, and they make toilet paper and they make profits, and they're looking at numbers, and they're so editors have an uphill battle themselves, to try to the numbers, is it selling enough? So I think that's we're trying to, as artists, enter a world that is not native to us.
Well, I'm being told I need to pivot to audience questions. I'm so sorry. We're running out of time, and we have a lot of questions from the audience. So Sandra Lopez says, Buenas noches from Columbus, Ohio. I am Dominican, and I have discovered so many Latinx writers on Instagram of all places. Where do you find new writers, and what are you reading now? So if anybody wants to chime in on where you discover new writers, feel free to.
There's so many. It's so hard. I just, sometimes I think I'm going to stop writing just so that I can read. There just isn't enough time. There's so many wonderful writers out there. I guess I learn about them through the enthusiasms of others. I've been writing down a few names that some of you have mentioned, so that becomes infectious for me. And if there's a reader whom I respect, they're booksellers, independent bookstores. That's what I love about them. They know your taste. They read. They actually read the books, and I can recommend them. My agent Stuart, every once in a while I get a book in the mail, and he's bought for me, and he always hits it. Yeah, so it's very personal to me. I guess I'm not as involved in social media that I connect that way, but I know that's one way that people do get.
Are you reading anything now that you would want to share, or you're that loud to share that you're reading?
I'm really into Magda. I don't even know how to pronounce her name. Magda Swabo, the Hungarian writer. She's a wonderful writer. I'm really interested in these women writers from other cultures right now. I'm reading, right now I'm reading, and I don't even know how to pronounce her name. The one, Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. And she's a Polish writer. Wonderful, strange book. Yep. So in part, I read to find out things that I need to learn to write the book that I'm struggling to write.
Thank you. And it looks like we have a new question because this is like round fire. Everybody go quickly. So whoever gets to answer gets to answer. What books do you have on your nightstand right now? And we can start with Reyna. What books do you have on your nightstand?
Well, I have Infinite Country by Patricia Engel. The book just came out a couple weeks ago, and I've been reading it one chapter at a time, and it's just been really great.
It's gorgeous. One of my favorites. Angie, what's on your nightstand?
Carolina de Roberti's The President and the Frog. That is available for pre-order, and I'm really excited. I love her. I mean, I learned about her from you, Lupita. You fell in love with Cantora, and I then fell in love with Carolina, and now I'm a fan.
And we're fans together. Juan, how about you? What's on your nightstand?
This is a book called Book of Itzolin
Oh, wow.
And the life and works of Itzolin Valdemar Garcia, who passed away at the age of 27. And these are his works, assembled by his mom, and probably published in a small press or at a printing press. And it's just amazing poetry. And he's the son of Cecilio Garcia Camarillo, as you know, a Chicano poet from Austin or San Antonio, that area, or Albuquerque. And I find his work extremely profound. He also includes drawings and images, and his stories, and they're just so deep, extremely deep. And he had a great ability. I would like to see this book reprinted, or part of it, this poetry, as a collection on its own. And then so I really recommend the book of Itzolin, number one. And of course, you've seen Anthony Cody's Borderland Apocrypha. And this is, well, there it is, a great experiment with history, lynchings of Mexicanos. And he uses various approaches, erasure and spiraling, a spiraling type. And so he's a master of using outlines and spirals and images, photographs, newspapers. So I find that to be also very I've got a lot more going on. The discussion on migrantes mexicanos throughout the century, and lynchings, it's like that. And Borderland Apocrypha by Anthony Cody, and kind of experimental writing with media, and the book of Itzolin, a young writer that passed away very early, and his incredible stories of himself and his relationships, and his scorching poetry. Just amazing.
I hope everyone's taking notes, or there's an ability to note take, because these are a lot of great recommendations. And could we pull up the next question? Okay, so this one comes from Carmen Price. What does being Latino mean to you? And let's start with Reyna. I'm sorry, Reyna.
Yeah, well, I don't know. That's a challenging question. What does it mean to me? I mean, I guess when I was in Mexico, I had never even heard the term Latino. I was a Mexican, and when I came here, that's how I saw myself, as a Mexican. But then, then I heard the term Chicana, and I never called myself a Chicana, even though I wanted to, because I wasn't born here, and I felt I didn't really have a right to call myself a Chicana. But then I was told that being a Chicana is a state of mind, so that I could call myself a Chicana. I got permission from other Chicanas to use that. So now I am a Mexican, sometimes I call myself a Chicana. And then, of course, I heard the term Latina, or now it's Latinx. And then I feel like, so to me, what that means is that I'm not just Mexican, but I'm part of a larger community that includes Dominicanas, like my comadres here, the Cubanas, the Colombianas, the Puerto Ricans. So then to me, it just meant that I was part of this big, beautiful community. And I learned to embrace that term, Latina. But I call myself all three. Yeah.
How about you, Angie?
It's funny because I always think of all of these terms: Latino, Latinx, Caribbean, all of this. I mean, I think Juan said earlier about fluidity and identity, and it's all about context, and as someone who travels, I'm always surprised at how I have to move through these identities, and in the end, these identities are brands, right? That are to sort of bring together communities that are, and usually they flatten us, right? And don't really take in the breadth of our complexity. So I have a very difficult time with it, but it's useful. When I was an organizer, early on in the 90s, and I was trying to do readings to attract people of color. If you do a reading and say women writers, you might not get any people of color. But when we said Caribbean women writers, all the Caribbean readers came, and all the Caribbean, or when we said Latinx writers, and all of a sudden our audience was Latinx. And then I said, oh, this is what these labels are for. These labels are for like they're kind of a light that you put out that people recognize, and they're gonna swarm around it. And but in reality, what do they have to do for us as human beings? Like, I never think about this as an identity politic until someone thinks it about me. And, you know, and then I think if I tell you I'm Latina, and I got this from a poet that I love, Don Lenny Martin, who has this thing that she says in one of her poems, and I'm going to say it badly, but she says something, when I say I am Black, what does that tell you about my interior? You know, like what information are you gathering from that? And it's the same thing as Latina. Like, if I say I'm Latina, what does that say to you? Unfortunately, because the representation of Latinas in the United States in media is predominantly us as sexualized beings or housekeepers or servants, what it says to most people is not something that I believe is my only identity. So it's problematic in a big way, but it serves a purpose when we're trying to brand, right? So that's what I have to say about Latinidad.
How about you, Julia? What does...
Well, yeah, I think that's really interesting, because when people say you're Latinx, what does that say about you?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's almost a kind of erasure sometimes, because it's not you. It's, you know, it's this monolithic term. But having come up from the 60s, where there wasn't even a box to check, you know, and there was things like Eskimo, colored, other, of Spanish origin, and then we became Hispanic, and then we became Latinas, and then, you know, all the evolutions, the terms, you know, sometimes have been baffling to me. But I think that vocabularies are important, because the first sign of empowerment is to name yourself, is to have the vocabularies. There were so many things that I've learned since, many from my students, that I didn't know how to talk about. Intersectionality? Wow, I lived in that place, you know. I knew that landscape, but I didn't have words for it. I didn't have terminology. So I think part of it is to realize, and we should know that as writers, you know, language is tricky. You know, it's a wild horse that we're trying to ride, and it's not a statue. And so we've got to be fluid about it, but we do need ways to speak about these things, you know, because they're important, and vocabularies are important. Think about the African-American civil rights movement, you know, that began with colored, and then it was Black, and then it was African-American, you know, it's always, it's not about being PC. I think we're looking for language and vocabulary to talk about things that are important, but we can't stop there, because then we erase each other, even within a community.
How about you, Juan? What does Latino mean to you?
Well, I'm going for humanity now. I'm a humanity. Yeah. I've been in the identity mercado for 50 years, you know. So I'm going for humanity now. It's gotten really tight in the identity mercado. So yeah, Chicano, Mexican American, Chicano, Chicanesco, Native, which I love, and on, you know. So, you know, or maybe Latin Y. I had a Y. Take out the X, put a Y there. Latin Y. So I think I'm just gonna go for humanity. You know, I'm a humanity dude.
Well, that's great. Our next question is from Jennifer. Do you write knowing that your work will be translated, and does that affect how you craft your sentences? Let's start with Angie.
No, none of my work had been translated until Dominicana, which I've been fortunate to have translated. And I learned that it's possible. I mean, they're trying to figure out, and I don't know why this, but I think it is important that Dominicana is being translated by a Dominican writer in Dominican Spanish. It's really been exciting to work with a Dominican translator, because I feel now when I read Dominicana in Spanish, translated by Kiani Antigua, who's a fantastic translator, it's almost like Dominicana has found its home. Because, even though my book is written in English, my character spoke to me in Spanish throughout the entire book. So to see it written in Dominican Spanish, it's almost like it's in full color. So it's been really exciting.
How about you, Reyna?
Yeah, no, I don't think about a translation when I'm writing. I mean, my books, my first novel was translated. My 2 memoirs have been translated into Spanish, but the second novel wasn't translated and still hasn't been. But I try not to think about that. Like, I figure that since I'm writing the book in English, I just focus on making sure that it flows really well in that language. And then I'll let the translator worry about the flow when they translate. But I can relate to what Angie's saying about how important it is to have, like, you had a Dominican translator for your work. And I have been fortunate with my books. I translated my first novel and I translated my memoir. They were not perfect translations because my Spanish is not perfect, since I stopped going to school in Mexico in 3rd grade. So that was my grade level of Spanish, was 3rd grade. And obviously living in the US, now I speak Spanglish. So there's like a lot of Spanglish in my translation. And I've been criticized a lot for my translation. So then for A Dream Called Home, I didn't translate it myself. We hired a translator based in Mexico, because I did want a Mexican translator. But then I did not like that translation because the translator used words that I do not know. Even from the first page, I had to get a dictionary and look up words. And he used like really fancy words in Spanish. And I felt that it didn't capture my voice, because that's not the way I speak Spanish. Yeah. And I had to spend like 200 hours redoing the translation and changing the vocabulary to one that I understood. So that was a difficult experience. But then the young reader's version of The Distance Between Us was translated in Mexico, and the editors, because it was also translated in the rest of Latin America, they hired an Argentinian translator to do it. And so that's the version that was published in Mexico. It's an Argentinian translation. And I was reading my book and it's like, wait a minute, I don't say torta de cumpleaños. And then instead of mojado, they put frijolero, because supposedly in Argentina, the term mojado doesn't exist. And the translator didn't know how to translate mojado. So they put frijolero instead. And that just didn't sound right to me. So after I read it, I felt that maybe, like I could tell that because it wasn't translated by a Mexican translator, the words were foreign to me, the expressions were foreign to me.
Yeah.
This is actually a really important connection to own voices, Reyna, because I think that one of the reasons I wanted so much for Dominicana to be translated into Spanish is because I wanted the possibility of intergenerational book clubs, right? Where mothers, daughters, tias, friends could all read the same book, right? And imagine you have intergenerational where your mother and you're Dominican and you're reading this book because you're just like, oh my God, this is my story. And then you share it with someone and they're reading an Argentine translation of the Dominican story. It's painful a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Because it takes you outside, right? I don't think someone from Mexico is going to read Dominicana and think it's about a Mexican, right? They're going to think it's about a Dominican and they'll accept that the Spanish is on the outside. But But I think for those of us own voices readers, right? Like, that's the part that hurts, is when it's so easy to make the choice of hiring a translator from that experience that could bring that kind of intimacy. I mean, other translators could do it too. Great translators will translate Dominican into Dominican, I believe, right? But if you have the possibility, why not, right? So,
Yeah.
Juan, do you have anything to add in terms of writing your books and crafting your work, having in mind that there'll be a translation for it?
No,
Spanish?
I don't think about future translations. I wish him the best, you know. I wish him the best. Otherwise, you know, it's such a great. It's so beautiful to be writing, let's say, in English, and then turn it into, then just change the gear into Spanish in the same line or the next line, and then so that's a beautiful thing. Or taking one of your poems in English and then writing the Spanish version of it yourself, and or writing it with the sense of really getting into the melodies of Spanish or the sounds in Spanish, and creating words in Spanish and creating them in English and translating that created word that you created, so the only one, and then doing it in Spanish. I really love those actions in poetry. Of course, it's poetry. And then Spanish is so beautiful. It offers so many instruments, so many sound instruments or sonic instruments when you use certain words and you slam them close to each other, or the arrangement of the words. All that is just, you know, just delicious. It's a delicious experience and to read as well. Recently, I wrote a poem called California Brown. And in California Brown, I don't know where it's online somewhere, and I don't know where it is, but it's online. That's the only place that it exists. I don't even have a copy. And I decided, you know, I said, what happened to Borderlands Pachuco? What happens to that? What happened to that language? What happened to that dialect? I don't see it anymore. It used to be one of our great things to do when we were, you know, solid Chicanos. Órale, carnal, mira, guacha, this is the way it's going to go, you know, like that. And so I said, what happened? It used to be in the poetry, Raúl Salinas, Ricardo Sanchez, Abelardo Delgado, Alurista, on and on, Viviana Cermeño, and on. So you know what I said to myself, I'm just going to bring it back to my page. And so I did English and Pachuco dialect and back to English. And I really enjoyed it. But in terms of the poetry getting published somewhere else, it will change, like you said, Reyna. And as you mentioned, it's gonna change. It's not gonna be. I translated recently. Imagine I was asked to translate Crossover by Kwame Alexander, basketball book, and it uses kind of rap in it. Not rap, but spoken word. And of course, it's going to be in a particular way of speaking. So why don't you translate it, Juan? It's a good project for you. Oh yeah, but you know, it's a lot of pages, man, and you know, and it has all kinds of different ways of speaking in it, and it really riffs, you know. And look at that first one. I can't even do the first one. Crumping. How do you say crumping in Spanish? Crumpeando, you know. So I had to just jump in. I took it head on, and it's not as smooth as like Reyna said. It's going to be some things in there that just go way off the grid. Right. And then there's another translator at the editorial, you know, in the editorial office that they know Spanish too. They have their Spanish translator editors. So then they retranslate it by retranslations, and that's okay, you know. But it just shifts. Everything shifted into words like Reyna said. I didn't know. I said, what? Right. You didn't say that. But maybe that's good. You know, it has more audiences.
Well, I just want to thank everybody. We're out of time, unfortunately. We had so many questions we couldn't get to. I just want to let you know, Julia, Angie, Reyna, Juan, you guys are very well loved. Our comment section had so many questions that I'm very sad we didn't get to. But I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for writing. As a Own Voices reader, it's been life-changing, and to just have your work in my hands and to be able to read through everything. So thank you. Thank you to Prince George's County Memorial Library System. And for those still listening, please either borrow or purchase these books from Loyalty or the other bookstore mentioned here too. We would love for you to support these authors, and that's the biggest thing that you can do, I think, to continue Own Voices authored books, is really put support into them. And I will turn it over to.
But first, gracias, Lupita, for what you've done.
Gracias, Lupita. Yes, and
Yes,
Angie and Reyna.
Thank you.
Monica.
And as we come to the end of our evening, we want to thank our guests. Thank you so much. We so appreciate you being a part of this conversation and for sharing your stories. It's so important. To our viewers out there, if you're interested in the works of these amazing authors, you can obviously find them at your friendly local library, or for purchase from such fine local bookstores as Curious Iguana in Frederick, Maryland, or Loyalty bookstores in Washington, D.C. and Silver Spring, Maryland. And finally, we'd like to thank our partners and sponsors, Prince George's County Memorial Library System, Frederick County Public Libraries, Charles County Public Library, Maryland State Library, and our state librarian, Irene Padilla, Maryland Libraries Together, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Thank you all for attending this evening. Stay safe and be well.